This is A History of Western Thought, Part 4, the Eleatic Philosophers. In this episode, we continue our study of the pre-Socratic philosophical period, and today we are discussing a school of thought called the Eleatic Philosophers. The name Eleatic comes from a Greek colony called Elea, which is actually in modern-day Italy. Now, the majority of the philosophers associated with the school are from that area, but as we begin, the first philosopher that is sometimes associated with the Eleatics is a man named Xenophanes. Now, Xenophanes was from Ionia, but he traveled throughout Greece for most of his life. And in his travels, he wrote poetry, he spoke about both theology and philosophy, and he was a critic of many of the ideas that were prevalent in ancient Greece. And that's really where his influence is most prominent. What Xenophanes is especially well known for is his criticism of the typical understanding of the pantheon of Greek gods. And he criticized the notion that the gods would be so similar to men. They would look like men, wear men's clothing. And he pointed out that if animals were to create their own gods, they would look like them as well. And he also pointed out that in various nations, everybody seems to think that God looks just like they do and acts just like they do. And so in opposition to the traditional view of the Greeks, Xenophanes argues that God must be one, not many. And God must not be like humans, but he must be something much greater and different from his creation. In particular, what Xenophanes criticizes is the idea that God is constantly in the process of change. And if you remember, this is an idea that we've been discussing in the previous philosophers, is the nature of change and constancy in the world. And for Xenophanes, God must be a source of consistency or of constancy in the world rather than that of change, which is typically the view of the Greek gods, that they are constantly in a process of change and repentance and turning from one way or another, just like humans are. But for Xenophanes, God is not like this. He says this: God is one, supreme among gods and men, and not like mortals in body or mind. The whole of God sees, the whole perceives, the whole hears. But without effort he sets in motion all things by mind and thought. He always abides in the same place, not moved at all, nor is it fitting that he should move from one place to another. And so what Xenophanes does is he outlines some of the attributes of what are going to be called classical theism, or the classical view of God that differs from other views of God that are more anthropomorphic in nature, or in other words, views of God that make God much more similar to men. And so he argues that God sees all things, he is omniscient, he is present in all places, he is omnipresent. Now, there's been some debate about exactly what Xenophanes meant by these things and how he is to be taken. There are some philosophers, such as Aristotle, who basically argue that what he was arguing for was a kind of pantheism, that in some sense everything is God. But others, such as Clement of Alexandria, the early Christian thinker, argued that he was a kind of proto-Christian, criticizing the Greeks in the ways that the early Christians would also criticize the Roman gods. Some skeptics and materialists have said that Xenophanes really predates them as a kind of critic of understandings of religion. However, it's really not right to call him a skeptic because he pretty clearly does believe in the existence of God, just not the anthropomorphized view of God that was popular in Greek thought. And following Xenophanes, we have the one who is the real founder of the Eleatic school of philosophy, and that is Parmenides. Now, it's Parmenides who is from Elea, and he takes up a number of disciples who will continue to develop the ideas that are found in his writings. And Parmenides' philosophy can, in many ways, be seen and understood best by understanding Heraclitus, who came before him. So if you haven't watched the previous episode, I would encourage you to do that to get an understanding of where Heraclitus was coming from. So Heraclitus basically said that all of reality is change. Parmenides fought against this idea and instead said that essentially everything remains the same. And so this is what is sometimes known as the distinction between being and becoming. While Heraclitus spoke of reality as a becoming, Parmenides spoke of reality as pure being. Now, essentially, Parmenides argued that change is not real at all. Change is merely an illusion. And in our senses, we seem to experience the world through change all the time. So everything about us, everything about the world is in constant flux, as Heraclitus said. So what Parmenides said is basically that we cannot trust our senses or our sense experience at all to give us a real picture of what the world is really like. And so Parmenides argues that logically this is inconsistent, and this is why he believes that change is inconsistent. He essentially argues that everything that exists is either in a state of being or in a state of non-being. Now he argues for a kind of monism that all being is one. And so if something is going to change from one state to another, the only way that can happen is if something goes from being to non-being. Something can't just go from being to being, or else it would remain the same. So if there is change, it has to go from being to non-being. Well, then he says that really doesn't make sense for something to become non-being, because then it no longer is. So therefore, he argues, change is essentially impossible and illogical, because something cannot become being and then non-being and then become being again. So therefore, everything must remain constant and the same as being, which permeates all. He also argues similarly, dealing with the question of unity and multiplicity. And so he asks the question if there is more than one thing that exists. And he uses the same premise to say that, well, being, if it is to be divisible, has to be divided by something other than itself. But the only option for being other than being itself is non-being. And non-being cannot have an impact on anything because it does not exist at all. So therefore, being cannot be divided at all. And therefore, everything is one. Now, Parmenides' thought was taught and defended by a couple of his disciples. The most popular of those is a man named Zeno. Now, Zeno came up with a bunch of paradoxes, or these logical arguments to try to demonstrate that change and divisibility are an absolute impossibility. Now, whatever you think of the conclusions of Zeno's arguments, and the majority of people do not believe the conclusion of Zeno's arguments, it must be admitted that they are pretty clever and interesting, and philosophers throughout the centuries have sought to interact with them because they are that influential and important. For example, let's look at one that is called the dichotomy paradox. Now, in the dichotomy paradox, think of somebody who was walking for a mile. Okay, and at the beginning of their walk, they have to walk partway there before they get all the way there. And so they have to travel, say, half a mile to get to the mile point. But before they get to half a mile, they have to walk a quarter of a mile. But before they get a quarter of a mile, they have to walk an eighth of a mile. And what Zeno argues is that in order for someone to get from one place to another, you can infinitely divide the amount of space that they have to travel, because an eighth becomes a 16th, becomes a 32nd, becomes a 64th, and you can continue to divide that ad infinitum. And what you have then is an infinite number of distances that one has to travel in order to reach the end, because it's infinitely divisible. And if that is the case, you cannot travel an infinite number of distances to get anywhere, and so therefore change and motion is impossible. A second is what is sometimes known as the arrow paradox. And Zeno argues this way. Say you have an arrow that is in the air and it's going toward a target. Now take that particular arrow at any moment in time when it is making that supposed motion. Now at any particular moment, that arrow is still. It's not moving at all. And in order for the arrow to move, it cannot remain perfectly still. But take the next moment in time. Is it moving then? No, it is perfectly still as well. So at any particular moment in time, the arrow is not actually moving at all, but it remains still. And so if at every moment in time there is no actual motion occurring, then if you add all those moments in time together, similarly, there can be no action occurring at all. A third is a paradox of the grain. Now, what Zeno argues is that if there is one grain that falls onto the ground, you cannot hear anything. In other words, it doesn't make a sound. However, if you have a large amount of grain and it all falls on the ground, it does make a sound. Now, this doesn't make sense, because if one grain doesn't make a sound and all that the larger pile of grain is a bunch of smaller grains, then how is it that a bunch of no sounds can become a sound? How can nothing suddenly becomes something. And he argues that this simply does not make any sense, and so we cannot trust our sense experience. Now, these are only a few of the paradoxes that we have. These are about half the ones that we have record of, and the others are interesting as well, but basically follow this same train of thought. So what are we to think of Zeno and the Eleatic school today? Well, they certainly do come up with some clever arguments, and ones that have been seen as influential enough that philosophers even today continue to interact with them. And what we see in these philosophers is a turn toward the realm of ideas in some sense. Some people would say that they are precursors to idealism, though it would not be right to say that they are idealists themselves. What they are, in terms of their relation to idealism, is those who do question the reliability of sense experience. Though it must be noted that when they do speak about being, they probably don't mean anything that is purely in the realm of ideas, but they're talking about being as something physical. So what these philosophers do as we get into the future of philosophy is set forth a number of ideas that have to be dealt with, dealing with the realities of change in the world, as well as permanence in the world. And it is the attempt to interact with both Heraclitus, who argues that everything is change, as well as Parmenides, who argues that there is no change, that is going to lead to some of the foundational concepts of Western thought as developed by Aristotle. If you liked this episode, please do like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next program. Thanks so much for watching.